West India Lights by Henry S. Whitehead. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by Ben Tucker. West India Lights by Henry S. Whitehead. Chapter 1. The Portrait. I had engaged Melbourne House, a fine old mansion on the hill back of Frederickstead, on the West India island of Santa Cruz, for the winter, and I found when I arrived one November day that I was to have one more room at my disposal than I had bargained for. This was really an end of the second-floor passageway, which had been made into a room by a slat partition. My landlady, old Mistress James Desmond, had moved out certain articles of decrepit furniture for the housing of which I had agreed to give up the use of that room, which looked like an old-fashioned wine-closet. I bestowed my trunks and packing cases on the floor and had Esmeralda, my coal-black servant, clear off the shelves for hand luggage and odds and ends. In order to do so, Esmeralda had to move several discarded belongings which had been left there, and among these were a large old-fashioned picture in a heavy wooden frame which had escaped the ravages of woodworms for countless decades. I noticed the old picture when I was bestowing some of my own odds and ends near where it stood, and carried it into my workroom to have a look at it. At first I had thought it was a chromo, but this was no chromo, oleo, nor anything mechanically produced. It was a paint. I looked at it closely with interest. The composition was amateurish, the coloring was too faded with the dimness of years for me to make much of it. I carried the painting into the bathroom, made a lather, and after taking the ancient and brittle canvas out of its frame, began to clean it with soap and water. I dried it, and then used a little typewriter oil on it. The colors began to jump out at me. The artist had been plainly a lover of color. My restoration accentuated the amateurishness of the thing, but I forgave the artist much because of the subject he, or she, had chosen. My imaginary young lady in her flowered muslin dress of a century ago had chosen to depict the execution of a pirate, and the pirate could have been none other than Fawcett. There could be no doubt about it whatever. That bloody villain was the only pirate that had ever been executed at St. Thomas's, except his own two mates, who had paid the penalty of their murderous rascality at the same time. And this was a picture of St. Thomas, painted photographically, apparently from the deck of some vessel conveniently anchored offshore. The costumes, too, were of Fawcett's period. His execution had taken place in September 1824, and that, too, fixed the period of the painting. High as the colors were pitched, stilted as were the many characters, there was something convincingly lifelike about the thing. Apparently this picture had been painted from actual observation. The colors, too, on reflection, were not so much exaggerated. Did one do well here to wear smoked glasses in the middle of the day? Was not the glowing indigo of the Caribbean incredible? The scarlet of the hibiscus painful to the unaccustomed eye? I fastened up the canvas with carpet tacks on the wall of my workroom where it would catch the north light. I began at its upper corners, pressing tacks along its upper edge, and then pulling it down flat, inserted others along the lower edge and up the sides. The last tack went through the arm of one of Fawcett's lieutenants, just where he had hurtled through the air at the end of his rope over at the extreme left-hand edge of the picture. A little trailing CL was the signature. That afternoon, at Estate Montparnasse, where I had been invited hospitably for tea, I told my hosts, the MacLeans, about my find, and I made it an excuse, though none was needed, to ask them to drive in for tea with me the following afternoon. When they saw it, I think it made the same impression on them that it had upon me at first. I imagined that only their impeccable courtesy prevented their telling me that I had been gloating over something very like a chromo. It was Miss Gertrude MacLean who first began to get the real charm of it. I noticed her leaning close and examining it very carefully. Suddenly, as I talked with Mr. and Mrs. MacLean, there came from Miss Gertrude a little smothered cry, an explanation almost like a sigh, but so poignant, though subdued, that her mother turned quickly toward her on hearing it. We both stepped toward her. "What is it, Miss Gertrude?" I inquired.
"What is it, my dear?"
echoed her mother.
"It's this poor creature,"
replied Miss Gertrude MacLean, indicating the fellow whose arm I had transfixed.
"Why, he's in agony. It's dreadful, I think. It's wonderfully done. It's quite startling, in fact. The little figures are wonderfully done, if you look at them closely. I think they must some of them anyhow, be portraits, just as you said yesterday, Mr. Canavan. This one certainly is almost uncanny.
We all looked at the dangling fellow. I had not seen him since yesterday. Curious. He was not, as I had supposed, dangling. He was hurtling through the air, had not quite reached the end of that fatal fall from the drop where stood the hangman, a terrible, fierce fellow. No, the rope was not yet wholly taut. That knot of 7 turns had not broken the poor devil's neck. He was alive as any of the spectators. But it was not this new interpretation of the artist's skill, not the look of the tortured horror, which had so moved Miss Gertrude. No. What caused me to close my eyes in a spasmodic, futile effort to shut out a deeper horror, caused me to lean heavily against the table, fighting to retain some measure of my composure, was the fact that the man's expression had changed since yesterday. Now, out of his horror-shot, protruding, agonized eyes, came straight at me a look of strange reproachfulness. And down his little painted arm, from the place where I had driven the carpet tack through it, were running little drops of bright red blood. I opened my eyes and turned to my guests. I had pulled myself together with an effort which was like a wrench. I bowed to Mrs. McLean. "Shall we go down for tea?" I inquired. Miss Gertrude lingered behind after the rest had passed out of the room. She took my arm, and I could feel her slim white hand trembling.
"I think it is very dreadful, somehow, that picture," she whispered confidingly. "But, oh, Mr. Canavan, it's fascinating. I wonder if C.L. really was a girl. Perhaps we can find out."
"We'll see what can be done," I replied with an attempt at lightness, and she smiled up at me most charmingly in a way she has. A lively young girl is Miss Gertrude McLean, daughter of old Scottish gentry planters, people who had come to the island in the old days. When the McLeans had gone after tea, I went upstairs and pulled out that tack. I will admit that I almost expected to see fresh blood flow from the wound. Nothing of the sort happened, of course. I looked closely at the place. Red paint, put on 100 years ago. The reproachful expression I had imagined was, too, wholly absent from the man's face. I was looking at the picture now by electric light. The marked differences in light effects that we get in the West Indies might well be expected to play queer optical tricks. They are a land of the imagination, the islands. Some of the original crudity, too, seemed somehow to have got back into the picture. Chapter 2. Something besides paint. After breakfast the next morning I went straight into the picture. In this clear, raw morning light there remained only that look of apprehension which the artist had painted in. No agony, certainly no reproach. Queer tricks, strange illusions, those begotten of our tropical sun. I examined the tiny hole left by the carpet tack under a magnifying glass. The blood stains of my aroused imagination of yesterday were stains of century-old brittle paint, probably a slip of the brush just after touching in these flamboyant trees, or a scarlet head turban or so. Mere little meaningless incidental dabs they were, and nothing more that I was able to discover. That afternoon I called upon old Mrs. Desmond, who owns Melbourne House. She is a little faded lady of the old Irish gentry, of a family which has been in the West Indies since early in the 18th century. She was dressed as usual in hot-looking black silk with a little lace around the edges. There was about her a penumbra of veils and a suggestion of quaint leather reticules. She has, too, that dead-white, colorless complexion of the West Indian Caucasian lady who has spent the bulk of a long lifetime avoiding the direct rays of the sun. I told Mrs. Desmond about finding the picture and our curiosity about the identity of the artist. She smiled at me kindly, rocking herself back and forth in an enormous Copenhagen mahogany rocking chair the while, and fanning herself with a regularity which suggested doom. "It was painted by my aunt, Mr. Canavan," said Mrs. Desmond, "who was Camilla Lanigan, my mother's elder sister. She died before I was born, about 1841. I'll not be positive. 'Tis said she was a remarkable woman in her day, and if you'll wait till I'm dead and gone, I'll tell you what's known about her." "With pleasure, Mistress Desmond, and may that day be a long way off, as long as you care to have it yourself." "What I can tell you is indeed no credit to the Lanigans and their gentry, you'll understand," continued Mrs. Desmond. "She was of a very inquiring disposition, and I dare say she learned much that she would have done better to leave alone, about the doings of the blacks and all. My grandfather, Cornelius Lanigan, that was,
and her father was a gentleman merchant there in St. Thomas. It was from St. Thomas that James Desmond took me when we were married to live here on Santa Cruz, and I no more than a child of 18, Mr. Canavan. It was in 64 I was married, and all I know of my Aunt Camilla Lanigan I learned from the sayings of my mother before that year when I was a girl at home. There was little she did not know about the Obeah of the black people, so 'tis said, nor indeed of the voodoo as well, belike. Their mother being long dead, and my own mother the younger of the two sisters, there was no one to stop my Aunt Camilla from doing much as she liked. The black people held her in great respect, so 'twas said. As to the picture itself, I can tell you but little about it. It was in the house when I was born, in 46 that was, and my mother had a great dislike for it. 'Twas I who would be taking it out of an old dust-box where it was kept now and again, and frightening myself as a child would, with the queer little figures and the hanging. When I was married, I begged for it, and I think my mother was glad to be rid of it, for the memory of my Aunt Camilla was still in the house there in St. Thomas. James Desmond, my husband, would never allow it to be hung on the wall, saying that it was indelicate of a lady to have painted such a scene. And I believe he was in the right of it, Mr. Canavan, with all respect to my Aunt Camilla. I thanked the dear old lady for her information as I bowed over her withered hand at parting. Her last remark was cryptic and somewhat startling. "'Twas more than paint, belike, went into the composition of that picture, Mr. Canavan." I called up Miss Gertrude as soon as I was back at Melbourne House. "I have some information about the picture and the artist," said I. "Come as early as you can manage it," said Miss Gertrude, and after dinner I started. "Oh, Mr. Canavan," said she eagerly when I had recounted what Mrs. Desmond had told me. "How I wish I might see it again now at once." "I had anticipated that," said I. "It lies on the table in the entryway." We laid it out on the mahogany center table and looked down at it together in silence. At last Miss Gertrude spoke. "What do you see now in his expression, Mr. Canavan?" I did not need inquire in whose expression. A baffling, elusive change appeared to have taken place now that we were looking down at him under the electric light. "Expectation," said I slowly. I hesitated. It was not quite expectation. Interest? Not quite that either. I pondered the matter, the bizarre whimsicality of it making its natural appeal to my mind the while. "Hope," I cried at last. "And coming through the hope, a wish." "Yes, yes," cried Miss Gertrude, clasping her hands excitedly. It seemed to me almost as though there were something he wanted to tell us." She hurried over these hesitating words, and now that they were spoken, there was a look of relief on her lovely face. "Your moral courage is better than mine, Miss Gertrude," said I, "for that is what was really in the back of my mind. It seemed to me too preposterous to put into words." Her eyes glowed with an enthusiasm, almost childish. She placed her hand upon my arm. "Do you suppose we could find out what it is?" Her voice was very low. "We could try," said I. The whimsicality of the proposal had intrigued me. "But how?" cried Miss Gertrude. "That's what I'm puzzling my poor brains about," I answered. "One cannot converse with a little figure 2½ inches high and made of paint. No, we cannot just talk to him and expect him to answer. He hasn't the apparatus. He's only a brittle little mannequin fastened down flat on some very tender old canvas. He can't speak and he can't write, but somehow he does seem able to change his expression. If there really is something in him, something besides paint, as old Mrs. Desmond hinted, at least we're not meddling with that for any wicked purpose, whatever Mrs. Desmond's Aunt Camilla Lanigan may have had in mind." "Do you remember that paralyzed old man in Monte Cristo?" inquired Miss Gertrude eagerly. "Noirtier de Villefort's father, you remember?" "He was one of the friends of my childhood," said I. "What about him?" "He could move only his eyes, and yet his granddaughter talked with him. She answered him questions that could be answered by yes or no, and he closed the right eye for one and the left for the other." "Yes," said I dubiously. "Well," she said, looking down at the picture, "shall we try him?" I stepped over and looked at the mannequin closely. "I'm looking to see if Mrs. Desmond's Aunt Camilla gave him ears," said I lightly.
Apparently she put blood in him. And I proceeded to tell Miss Gertrude the incident of the carpet tack.
"We'll have to work out the questions very carefully," said she.
I looked at her in amazement. "Can you seriously mean it?" I asked.
"Look at him,"
cried Miss Gertrude, and put her hands over her eyes and sank down upon the sofa. I stepped quickly toward her, alarmed.
"No, no," she cried. "I'm all right, only startled a little. Look for yourself, if you please, Mr. Canavan."
I looked, and for the life of me I could not escape the conviction that there was a wry smile on the mannequin's face. "My God," said I, and did not apologize. I almost hesitate to proceed. Chapter 3. Two Things. Well, we sat down together after that and worked the thing out. The evening was before us. The rest of the family were dining with friends and would not be home before 11. It was plain to us that he could move, although he had not done so while anyone was actually looking at him. The fact that this last change had come upon his countenance in the briefest of intervals would indicate somehow that he could also hear. For it seemed plain to us in our eerie mood of that strange evening that the smile was one of satisfaction, induced by our conversation. He wanted us to try to talk to him. We decided to formulate certain questions, ask them, then turn away and, after a short interval, look at the mannequin again. The method of communication we derived from Noirtier as the simplest possible. Miss Gertrude asked the first question.
"We think you wish to communicate with us," said she, in a still small voice. "We shall ask you questions, and you are to close your right eye if the answer is yes, and your left if it is no. Will you answer?"
Then we sat, side by side, on the sofa, watching the great clock in the corner of the drawing-room ticking off the seconds of that minute which we had decided to allow to pass before looking at him again. It was a long, long minute, that one. At first I felt like a fool, but that feeling dissipated itself as soon as we had together bent over the picture at the expiration of that first minute. The right eye had drooped in a kind of leering half-wink, precisely as though Miss Camilla Lanigan had painted it so 100 years ago. After several long minutes of silence between us there on the sofa, I said, "I'm going to ask the next question, if you don't mind." She nodded. I walked over to the table. The eyes were alike again. "Have you more than one thing to communicate?" I inquired. I came back to the sofa again and sat down, my eyes once more on the clock. Again we bent over the picture.
"There's a slight droop in the right eye," said Miss Gertrude.
The mannequin had answered yes again. After that, somehow we felt freer. 2 questions, the real ordeal of the thing, were over and past. There was little feeling of strangeness from then on. It was precisely as though we were talking with some person of flesh and blood like ourselves, with someone not immediately present, as though we were talking over the telephone. It was something like that. He had 2 things to communicate. We took thought now how to proceed. The eyes, alike, were always open and staring straight ahead whenever we approached with a new question, and so it continued through to the end. I thought of a necessary question. "Have you more than 2 things to communicate?" I asked. "No," came the answer. "Does the first thing concern you?" I ventured. "Yes." "And the second thing, does that also concern you?" This time, when we looked for the answer, the eyes had not moved at all, so far as we could tell. I glanced up at the electric light. Our lights not infrequently change their density, go up and down without warning. We have only the little local electrical plants, one in each of the towns. The light appeared even enough. We were a little nonplussed, for although I had been telling myself subconsciously all along that the whole thing was a farce, a bit of childish play, I'd come by now to expect an answer. "Perhaps it's because we asked him an unanswerable question," I suggested. "I'll try to clear it up."
"He's helping," said Miss Gertrude. "He's only showing us that it was asked wrong."
I looked down at her and smiled, and she smiled back at me. "Does the second thing concern more than you? That is, someone else?" I asked the pirate. "Yes," came the answer.
"Is Mr. Canavan the other person?"
asked Miss Gertrude. I smiled again at this. If there was anything that could be construed as an answer, I certainly expected that it would be no. The answer was yes. I began to feel the beginnings of a cold consternation. but I found Miss Gertrude smiling happily.
"I thought so,"
said she simply. Women, most of them certainly, are beyond me. It was a woman who had painted this picture. Miss Gertrude hastened to ask another question.
"Do you want to tell Mr. Canavan what he can do for you first, and then what you're going to do for him in return?"
"Yes."
"Do you wish to be released from something?"
"Yes, he does," reported Miss Gertrude, who was now asking the questions, I being seated for the time being alone on the sofa.
"Do you wish to pass out of existence?"
She nodded over to me to show me that he did.
"Can we accomplish that for you?"
"He says we can." We were making progress, it appeared. She clapped her hands gaily. All her gravity had disappeared. It was merely a game to her, then. I had almost begun to suspect that she had been taking the thing seriously.
"I thought it would come out more or less like that," she announced. Then, "The poor, poor man,"
said she softly, and I wondered once more. She returned to the picture and looked down at it for a long time.
"Is there anything else that can be done for you?"
she inquired. There wasn't, it seemed. I will summarize for brevity's sake the series of questions which followed and the replies. We were to find out how to obtain the reward. Then we were to ask no further questions. I was to take the picture home, put it back on the wall, and destroy it the next morning, tomorrow. All this seemed to me on the sofa grotesque, unintelligible. I was almost becoming bored with this seemingly foolish play, but nothing would stop Gertrude McLean.
"Is it a material reward for Mr. Canavan?"
"Yes," came the answer to this one. And going over and looking down at the mannequin, such as human nature, or our somewhat unstable lighting system on Santa Cruz, that it seemed even to me in that mood that I could discern the merest ghost of a twisted grin on that strange little face beneath the looming, cruelly twisted knot of hangman's rope. I will bring what seemed to me an increasingly absurd performance to its conclusion. I left with definite instructions to dig in the northeast corner of the cellar under Melbourne House, that cellar once devoted to the housing of materials for planters' punches and sangaree, and now fallen to a low estate of habitation for spiders, and perhaps an occasional scorpion thriving in its ancient dust. Chapter 4. Release. My brain, I will confess it, was in a kind of whirl as I drove home that night from Montparnasse House. When I had obediently hung the picture back in its place on my workroom wall, I took a good long searching look at it. It seemed as wooden, as laboriously limbed, as amateurish, as on that day when I had rescued it from the dust-room. There were the strutting St. Thomas gentry and merchants, a lordly group of aristocrats who had come out to see Captain Fawcett die. There, too, were their silken and bemuslined lady-folk, the Danish soldiers in their box-like Frederick the Great uniforms, the swarming pop-eyed negroes, the hangman, Fawcett, and his two mates. I went to bed. That had been a strange, weird evening. To dig under my own house, it was too much, and I had promised Gertrude McLean to do so. Promised, too, to destroy this picture the next morning. Awkward, that. Gentlemen do not build bonfires in their backyards in the West Indies. Our very cooking is done on charcoal pots, or on an occasional oil stove. We have no gas, and coal we know only as a commodity for fueling ships. It would have to be a coal pot. That is the idea I carried with me into sleep, the last thing I remembered until the sun, the bright morning sun, saluted me awake. "Keep a fire in the coal pot, Esmeralda, if you please," I called through the bathroom door. "I want to use it myself a little later." I stepped into the workroom to take down the picture. I'd promised to destroy it. I would keep my word. I looked at it for the last time under that clear, pitiless, blazing morning sunlight. Probably the nervous strain had been heavier than I had imagined. I managed to control myself. I made no shamdramadan, which is the blacks' term for foolishness or rascality. I avoided, too, by holding on tight to the table's edge, a kaffoon, which meant a fall. For he was not, it seemed now, and could never indeed have been, if paint is paint, hurtling through the air in his last instant of life, so to express it. The rope, as I looked at it, was unmistakably taut. That deadly knot of 7 turns of good new manila rope must already have struck home under one of those strange little ears into which last night Gertrude McLean and I had. I set my face down for a moment in my shaking hands. The eyes of the figure which we had watched last night. His eyes were unmistakably, closed like those of his two companions in wickedness. He had joined Captain Fawcett of the fine plum-colored laced coat and Hessian boots. Our pirate really swung now. He was dead, delivered, it came through my shuddering mind, from those uncanny sorceries of Camilla Lanigan, she who had been so strangely respected by the black people of St. Thomas, she who knew their Obeah and their voodoo. I pulled down the picture a moment later with a firm hand and laid it out flat on my work table. I cut it into convenient strips for burning in a coal pot. Some of the old brittle paint flaked off in this process, and this I gathered up to the final crumb on a sheet of paper. But for the most part my penknife went cleanly through the old canvas. Downstairs I had found that Esmeralda had gone after the morning's supply of ice for the drinking water with the large thermos bottle, but a glowing coal pot stood on the floor of the little stone gallery outside the kitchen door. Into this I poured the fragments of the chipped paint and watched them bubble and hiss. I thrust in the strips, one after another. They curled, caught, and were swiftly consumed. Then I stirred the charcoal and a few sparks came out. Not a vestige of Camilla Lanigan's picture remained. I should have to wait until Esmeralda was gone for the afternoon and dig in that cellar in the hottest part of the day among the ghosts of wine barrels and demijohns. I stepped out into the yard to investigate. In a shed I found an ancient spade and, best of all, a thing like a mattock which might have been dug up on the site of Persepolis. These I carried down into the dim, cool cellar. With the spade I knocked loose the hooks of a hurricane shutter. That would dissipate the slight musty smell and also provide a better light for me that afternoon. Esmeralda was still bargaining among the bebustled vendors in the market when I returned upstairs to wash my hands. After lunch I waited until I heard Esmeralda leave. I watched the good soul as she walked down the hill through slanted jalousies, and when she passed out of sight around the corner by St. Paul's Church, I locked the front door and descended into the cellar. It was fairly cool and hardly musty at all. I hung my coat on an ancient hand-wrought nail and set to work. The hard pounded earth came away reluctantly as I picked at it, loosening the surface for a hole about 6 feet square. Alternately with this I shoveled out the loose dirt, placing it well to one side so that it would not run back. It was 2 when I began. The fort clock had chimed 3:30 a few minutes before I struck something metallic. It took me at least 15 minutes more before I had uncovered a small iron trunk in the corner of the large square I had opened. I broke the rusty lock with the edge of the spade, raised it, and there before me, and such is human nature that I must say I was more surprised than amazed at the very first, lay, neatly stacked in rouleaus from which the ancient cotton cloth fell away in shreds and flakes, row after row of gold coin, all the coinage of romance. Doubloons, of course, ancient American eagles, louis d'or, even a few East Indian mohurs. In a side compartment by themselves lay carefully packed in an assortment of jeweled implements, jeweled chalices and patens from the loot, doubtless, of those rich Spanish churches of Central and South American seaside cities, perhaps even from Puerto Rico and Santo Domingo. Jewelry, much of it monogrammed, gold plate such as had graced the hospitable boards of many a fabulously rich sugar baron of the islands of the 17th and 18th centuries. At the very bottom of this separate compartment, which was of the capacity of about 1/3 the trunk's cubical contents, lay flattened and stiff a sack of oiled silk. I picked it up and had to untie the leather pouch strings, so well was it preserved. I looked in and then thrust in my right hand, and even in the comparatively dim light of the old cellar, there leaped out at me the myriad coruscations of cut jewels, throwing back the light they had not known for fully a century. My hand was full of jewels, and I had hardly taken off the edge, the very topmost. Diamonds, rubies, sapphires, blazing emeralds. A king's, an emperor's ransom here, in the cellar of Marlborough House. The pirate. He had not misled us. What in God's name did it mean? Well, I had other things to think of besides mooning over that problem there in the cellar with a fair-sized fortune held in my hand, and God knows how much else there in the iron trunk, gold, vessels, jewels. I spent the next half hour carrying the trunk's contents up to my bedroom in the wholly unromantic iron pail in which Esmeralda boils the drinking water. I deposited them all in a kind of order, gold coin altogether, vessels and jewels separate, in 2 bureau drawers, turning out shirts and collars for this accommodation. I locked the drawers, stuffed the shirts into the mahogany wardrobe, placed the bureau key in my pocket, and returned to the cellar. There, by leaving open the old trunk's lid, I was able, in another half-hour of feverish work, which left me literally dripping and soaking, to get back and roughly to pound down all the dry earth I had taken out. When I had tossed the spade and mattock behind some ancient lumber, closed and hooked the hurricane shutter, and returned to my bedroom to strip off my soaking clothes before the most refreshing bath I can remember, it was precisely 9 minutes before 5, and Esmeralda would not be back until 5 precisely. Chapter 5. Courteous Interest. I remember sitting about 6:30, fresh and cool now, in white drill, waiting for Esmeralda to announce dinner, with a necklace of emeralds which I had taken out from the rest as soon as I saw it, to give to Miss Gertrude McLean. I had telephoned to Montparnasse House, and explained to her that I must see her as soon as possible. She had arranged that I was to call that evening after dinner. Among other matters, I had been considering my duty with respect to this find. It involved certain responsibilities, I began to see. I resolved to return anything that might prove identifiable. Apparently this was the hoard of some master pirate, possibly even that of Fawcett himself. Its disappearance, or rather the fact that it had never been discovered, was one of the standard mysteries of the islands. How, if that were the case, it had got itself under Marlborough House was apparently an insoluble mystery. I may as well mention here that the restoration has proved an actuality in 1 or 2 cases. A dozen gold spoons, monogrammed, have gone back to the representatives of the Despard family in Christiansted, and a lovely old tulip chalice, filigreed, with its attendant paten, all the way to Valparaiso. I dined that evening with the necklace loose in the pocket of my drill jacket. I fear I made only a sketchy meal. Esmeralda seemed disturbed. She thought, good soul, as she told me the next morning, that the crostadas of shellfish had not been up to standard. I had not really been certain what I was eating. On my arrival at Montparnasse House, I felt a note of restraint. It is very hard to describe what I mean. I can only say I felt it. Santa Crucian moods and similar delicacies of feeling are most difficult to describe. I remembered that I had called 3 times in the past 4 days. I was not unwelcome. It was not that. Otherwise, Robert McLean, Esquire, would have waited perhaps 15 minutes instead of 5 before having a swizzle served. But it was conveyed to me so subtly that I despair of making the matter clear that Mr. and Mrs. McLean, while recognizing me as an equal and a friend, were not quite clear as to what I was up to. They were not precisely objecting to my coming so often. They wanted me to know that they thought it unusual. That is the best I can do by way of saying how I felt. Mr. McLean and I conversed about new kinds of canes which were being tried out, about the labor situation, about the pink bullworm and how certain Montserrat cotton planters were meeting its ravages, about the newly inaugurated onion crop, about the perennial subject of the rainfall. The ladies, of course, joined in from time to time as Victorian ladies did, and as Crucian ladies do to this day, but the burden of that evening's conversation lay upon Mr. McLean and myself. Not so much as the overt flicker of an eyelash served to indicate the natural curiosity of my hosts as to why I was paying their hospitable estate house so many visits, but I could feel it all the time circulating in my blood. It was 9:30 when Miss Gertrude took her courage in her hands, looked straight at me, and said, "May I speak with you aside for a few moments, Mr. Canavan? Father and Mother will excuse us." I rose and followed her out onto the great gallery which runs all along the front of Montparnasse House, and I knew in my blood and bones that Mr. and Mrs. McLean did not so much as glance at one another when we had left the drawing-room. I could hear their voices as they conversed quietly together all the time we were on the gallery. Miss Gertrude led me to its extreme end, and there, in the mellow light of a full moon, and to the intoxicating accompaniment of jessamine and night tuberose odors, faced me. "I have something for you," said I, and laid the necklace across her hands. "This is for you, Miss Gertrude, with all my gratitude and all my admiration." "But I cannot accept this," she said, looking at the emeralds as they glowed in the moonlight. "You will wear it, I was hoping, on your wedding day." "But, Mr. Canavan, I am not considering being married. I am only 19. "But you will be married some day, God send, happily. Keep the necklace, and bring it out when that delightful young gentleman, who may be halfway worthy of you, comes along. Let it be a portion of your trousseau." "But I am not interested in
delightful young gentleman, Mr. Canavan."
This conversation, it seemed to me, had got rather far away from what Miss Gertrude had summoned me out there on the gallery to talk about. She was speaking again.
"I do not see why you should suggest such a thing to me, Mr. Canavan."
Women. I should never understand them. This, at the moment, I felt instinctively, hopelessly. I remembered sharply that almost telepathic feeling I have mentioned on my arrival. "I am sure I ask your pardon if I have offended you," I said lamely, and stood aside waiting for her to precede me back into the drawing-room. I bowed slightly to indicate that I was waiting for her to pass. I think I may have even made a slight, indicative motion of the hand. But she did not move, and I looked down at her, troubled, vaguely puzzled. Was this the simple, sweet Miss Gertrude who had entered into the comedy of that picture with an almost childish enthusiasm? That picture! I think I shuddered slightly. She reached out the necklace toward me, but I did not take it back. With the strangest, most poignant look on her face, she was speaking again. Like Annie Laurie's, her voice is low and sweet. All the phrases of that ballad of sentimental nonsense, as I was suddenly reminded, looking down at her, fit her like a glove.
"I think you have failed to understand me, and that is why you are vexed, Mr. Canavan. You see, I cannot accept your gift. I am no longer a child, you will remember, and such a gift could come only from a near relative, or... She looked down. Her courage had given out. I saw her face, red as a red rose in the faint whiteness of that pouring moonlight. The delicate moaning coo of a disturbed wood-dove came through the silent mahogany trees, and a little faint puff of the evening trade-wind came wandering across the sea, across acres of sweet grass. Light came to me then, and blinded me. "Or one who is to be your husband," I finished for her, bending my head toward her. She did not move, and I reached out and took both her dear hands in mine, where they lay like lilies. The necklace hung across her wrists between us. It was, suddenly, as though Annie Laurie played very softly and sweetly, and yet somehow madly, played by many well-tuned violins and fairy horns, surged all about me, and it went to my head like strong wine. "And will you let me be that one?" I asked her quietly. She left her hands where they were, and raised her lovely face and looked at me, all her shame gone now, and I took her into my arms. A little after we went back into the drawing-room, Mr. and Mrs. McLean were chatting quietly, precisely as we had left them. I bowed to both of them. "I must not delay the happiness I have in informing you," said I, and the words seemed to come to me with a clarity almost uncanny, the right words for such an announcement, "that I expect to have the honor of becoming your son-in-law. But assure you no one, not even a Canavan, can get ahead of a real Crucian of the old Scottish gentry when it comes to these matters of courtesy." "We are happy to welcome you into the family, Gerald," said Mrs. McLean, without the flicker of an eyelash. She rose and made me a quaint, old-world courtesy, and I bowed in return as she resumed her chair. Mr. McLean took his wife's hand in his and said, "My wife has spoken for both of us, Mr. Canavan." "Gerald has given me this," said Gertrude, and laid the necklace, blazing now under the electric chandelier, in her mother's lap.
Mrs. McLean examined it with interest, polite interest. Its value would easily have purchased estate Montparnasse. Yes, and several other contiguous estates thrown in.
"It is very kind of him," said she, and handed the necklace back to her daughter.
Gertrude gave it to her father to examine. He looked at it with much the same type of merely courteous interest, and then clasped the lovely thing about his daughter's neck, which is like the swan, as Annie Laurie has it. He kissed her gravely on her white forehead. "We must have in a bottle of champagne to drink your health," said he, and paused to bow to me again as he left the room to get it. Chapter 6. Requiescat in pace. Of course, I told Mrs. Desmond about everything, but no information could I derive from her that would throw any light on anything. She would only say, "After I'm dead, Mr. Canavan." But on the matter of the picture's destruction, she waxed eloquent. "God be praised," said she, "that the fearful thing is no more. 'Twas my poor mother, God rest her soul, that was always wishful of having it destroyed and never daring. And as for me, Mr. Canavan, as I've told you, there was more than paint went into it. But I believe every word. 'Tis enough of my Aunt Camilla's capabilities that I've heard about to leave no doubt in my mind.
After I'm dead, Mr. Canavan. After I'm dead, and not before."
And that was all we were able to learn. We had been married less than 2 months. The restoration of my estate was only just beginning to be underway when Mrs. Desmond departed this life at the age of 76. The English church was full, St. Paul's, and so too was the churchyard itself, for virtually the entire island turned out to pay its last respects to one of its most notable old inhabitants, a member of the old island gentry who passed these days one by one. Gertrude and I had come back on foot from the funeral. It is only a step to Marlborough House, where we were living until the estate house should be ready. From the funeral, to be met by a young colored fellow, a clerk in Lawyer Esperson's employ. He handed me a long envelope and asked for a receipt, which I gave him. The envelope addressed to me was one of Lawyer Esperson's. I tore it open, and within a brief document also addressed to me, and in the fine, beautifully formed, almost continental handwriting of Miss Desmond herself. I called Gertrude, and we sat down together, and I read it out.
"Dear Mr. Canavan, I have left instructions with Esperson that this is to be handed to you after my burial. I told you that I would clear up certain matters for you after I was gone. There are 2 mysteries connected. One is why I would not touch a penny's value of what you discovered under Melbourne House. The other is how the evil takings of a free trader could come there, to the residence of a respectable family. I shall hope to clear up both of these. As to how it was done, God and Satan know. I cannot tell you that. But this much I can and will tell you. Even before my time, we of the gentry have been constrained to marry among ourselves. It's new blood like your own these islands are needing. I hope you will remain now that you are to be married, and to one of a blood as good as your own. For the reason I mention, we are mostly related like royalty. I was courted by my cousin, James Desmond, whom I married. It was the uncle of my husband, Saul Macartney, who sought to marry my Aunt Camilla Lanigan in the generation before mine. This Saul was the only living child of his father, Thomas Macartney, who lived here on Santa Cruz and was a merchant and ship-owner in the island trade. It is because James Desmond was his nephew that Melbourne House came to us by inheritance. It belonged to Saul Macartney. This young gentleman was accustomed to go about the islands in charge of his father's vessel, the Hope, and in the intervals of these voyages he would be courting my Aunt Camilla Lanigan in St. Thomas. A young man he was, so it is said, with but little of the fear of God, and none of the love in his heart. When his father died, leaving him Melbourne House, the ships, 3 sugar estates, and a grand store here in Frederickstead, he was not content to marry my Aunt Camilla and settle down. Off he went in the Hope again before his father was well settled in his grace. And on that very voyage from which my Aunt Camilla had sought to dissuade him, the Hope was captured off Caracas by Fawcett himself. Saul Macartney, willing as always to turn to his own advantage what might betide, joined Fawcett, and rose to be second in command to the bloodiest villain that ever scourged the Caribbean. Now I am thinking you began to see light. The connection with the picture. What depended on that bitter fact? It had not been known to me before you dug it up that treasure had been placed under Melbourne House. But consider, Mr. Canavan, where better? It was Saul Macartney's property, and only came indeed into the hands of my husband, James Desmond, his nephew, on Macartney's disgraceful death on the gallows in St. Thomas. Nothing could have been easier for him to come ashore here, and Captain Fawcett with him belike, and do as he pleased on his own property. The people would bow to the ground before a free trader in those days, and the fat of the land was not too good for them. Many had their fine houses ashore. Was not Henry Morgan himself knighted and made lieutenant governor of Jamaica? Saul Macartney went and came as he wished, and even sought to continue his courtship with my Aunt Camilla Lanigan. It was that which roused the bitter hatred of her against him, Mr. Canavan, and woe betide the man that roused my Aunt Camilla Lanigan to hate. For she knew how to hate, and how to make her hatred count. And may God, our Heavenly Father, have mercy on her soul. Anne Jane Desmond.
That was all. Granting it was true, and it was plausible enough to be sure, it cleared up much that had been obscure. The identity of the pirate mate, for example. But, as Mrs. Desmond herself had said, it could not clear up how the thing had been brought about. Granted that Camilla Lanigan had acquired skill in black magic, and that, is a great deal to grant in any such case, or any case at all. The rest fitted together like the halves of a trysting ring. I saw it all from that point of view, and I shuddered internally. I raised my head and looked at my dear wife. Her eyes were shining, and there was in them rather more than a suspicion of tears.
"What a vengeance," she said in her low, sweet voice. "Saul McCartney, choosing the life of a free trader as against that of a decent merchant, reduced to what appeared on that canvas. Well, he is released now, Gerald. We released him, and he has rewarded us. I think we should pray for the repose of his soul. He is a century behind the others in purgatory."
"You believe," said I.
"If I were not certain you would call me Victorian,"
my dear wife smiled through that suspicion of tears,
"I should say, there are more things in heaven and earth, Horatio."
"We shall have to let it go at that, I imagine," said I. "But I am going to give St. Paul's Church a complete new set of altar hangings in brocades, with some such idea as you have suggested."
"Which idea?"
inquired my wife. "For the repose of his soul," I answered. End of West India Lights by Henry S. Whitehead.
Spooky Ventures is the home for spooky content and spooky merchandise on the web. Check it out today at spookyventures.com. And remember, always keep it spooky.